Roger, copy. Roger, copy.
Foreign policy, energy policy, etc., etc. But we want to give them a relational connection to it, something that they can actually do. So that's the point of Celestial Commons. My little intro before the intro. And with that, I'll switch over to the little presentation that I've got. So Celestial Commons started a couple of years ago. And as I mentioned, I had, like so many people, self-selected against doing anything in the space sector for a variety of reasons. And one of the big reasons that a lot of us buy into, we've probably all heard some version of this statement or this question at some point in our lives, probably a lot of points in our lives. What about all the problems here on Earth? It's a very, very common narrative. And it's a very powerful one too, because there are a lot of problems here on Earth, right? And there's certainly a lot of problems that face everybody every single day, or the vast majority of us every single day, that kind of push space into the background. So it might just be, family stuff. It might be economic issues, job problems, all of that kind of stuff. Worrying about your environment, worrying about your immediate geographic location, security, etc. But that narrative betrays a sort of like false choice scenario where it like pits one good thing against a whole bunch of other good things. Creates a sort of like a false choice scenario where we're forced to pick when we're not forced to pick. And the reality that at least we're aware of is that space is complementary. It's not to the mutual exclusion of all of those other problems. So a couple of years ago, I started Celestial Commons with the goal of addressing that false choice narrative and overcoming basically what I saw as the big road bump in the way of getting much more people involved and engaged with space. And at first, basically what we did is like public comms stuff. So we wrote articles, told different stories about space. And one of them was in actual fact about MoonDAO. So there was a couple of articles published about MoonDAO. We also published articles about a range of different other projects that were in some way, in the public interest, or talking about like projects and initiatives that weren't necessarily getting the attention that they deserve. So to zoom out a little bit, there is a whole bunch of different problems. I've mentioned a couple of them already. That sort of a kind of a nebulous problem around this issue. A lot of people don't care. For one, space is seen as too complicated. People think it's for engineers, Air Force pilots, and billionaires. Stories don't connect with people. People might feel like alienated and disenfranchised because they don't feel like they have anything to offer. You get the idea. There are a whole bunch of interconnected reasons why people might feel distant, disconnected, and disengaged from space, rightly or wrongly. But the
Daniel,
big problem.
Are you sharing your presentation here?
Am I? I thought I pushed the share screen button.
I'm just seeing Discord, just making sure.
Really?
Yeah.
Fix that.
This is just on my end. If we have anybody in the audience, let's see. Okay.
How's that?
How about this? Yep, I can see it here.
All right. Well,
cool.
Apologies.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's my I missed out on the big quote on screen anyway. So yeah, what about the problems here on Earth? And there's all the nebulous interconnected problems that I mentioned. So a lot of people don't care. They feel it's too complicated. They feel disconnected and alienated, etc., etc. But the big problem from a policy perspective, which is what our policy initiative is all about, is this funnel, basically. So in order to get governments and other stakeholders internationally aligning and basically doing the right thing, it's an inordinately complicated process in the best of times. And it basically involves all these steps. So usually you would have public interest. Public interest results in public conversation, public discourse. Public discourse creates public investment and pressure, which leads to something being a political issue, which leads to political investment from parties, politicians, the media, and other actors. And eventually, if you're lucky, you get effective policy. Now, what makes space, like some of these other issues, even more complicated is that it's not just enough to have good policy in one place. Like finance, like energy, climate, etc., in order to get a future in space where like these sorts of outcomes like we generally want, right? Like a policy alignment between nations and other stakeholders, benefits and opportunities are generally extended to all, peace and security, everybody working together towards shared goals and not fighting each other over things. You actually need some kind of policy alignment. It's not just enough to have it in one or two places. The problem is we more than just not having one or two of those things, we don't actually have any of those things. So as mentioned, there is a huge swath of any given population that just doesn't really think about space that much at all, if at all. And that creates a huge roadblock. The impact, if that roadblock continues existing, is that basically space won't be for everybody. As much as we like to say that it is, as much as like we like to offer that platitude, it really won't be for everybody. So there won't be social, cultural, or political connection to the final frontier. We won't realize the true potential for positive impact. There'll be decreased political pressure for cooperation, increased potential for conflict. Past mistakes like environmental damage get repeated. Present trends like inequality get exacerbated. Policy reflects vested interests. Eventually it gets to a certain point where the major players write their own policy, and ordinary people won't own the future. They just work there. The solution that we've come up with is, and I'll get to talking about it in more detail in a second. Rather, I should say that one part of coming up with the solution for us was realizing that just telling a good story isn't good enough. So as I mentioned, telling stories is kind of what we did for a little while, but from the beginning we knew that it wasn't really enough. And there have been other tidal waves of change that affect the whole world, and we're experiencing them at the moment. We're experiencing some of them at the moment, like climate change, like AI, and we need to learn from those experiences and get a head start. And when I talk about this, I often remember there was this article I'm from New Zealand, and there was a rural newspaper article from New Zealand from 1916, and that is not AI generated, that is actually real. And it was in something called the Waikato Times, which is just a tiny little newspaper, and it was about a new coal-fired power plant that was starting up, and it was talking about the long-term global effects of climate change. And 100+ years later, we're only just starting to be slapped in the face by the major effects of climate change, and people are only just starting to engage with the subject, and the ball starts to get rolling in terms of policy and all of that kind of stuff, right? We can't really wait around in the same way with these other changes like AI, like space. They are huge, and they are going to affect everybody. They are already affecting everybody, and impact only going to grow exponentially as time goes by. So we have to work out how we engage people by not just telling stories to try to engage them. We've been trying that approach for the last 40, 50 years. We've been trying to go out and say, hey, look, space is really cool. You should really, it affects your lives. Here's all these ways in it affect your life. And a lot of people just kind of nod and, focus on whatever else they've got going on. We have to find ways to get people directly engaged. As I said, MoonDAO is a huge part of that, I believe. And I think Celestial Commons can be another big part of that. What we are doing is, and I'm sure people have heard this term before, is a citizen participation project. And citizen participation takes a whole bunch of different forms, which I'll get to in a moment, but the essence of it is direct involvement in public processes. So it can range from simple observation through, like it can sometimes just be a poll, can be a kind of citizen participation, through to direct policy and decision making, which is closer to what we're going for here. The guiding principles that make it work are basically transparency and honesty. So if you go out and ask a bunch of people, let's say you're a political group, a political party or something like that, and you go out and you say, hey, we want to hear what the average citizens think about this policy issue. We want to collect a bunch of people together, like through random selection, like sortition, and we want you to come in and tell us what you think. Now, if you lead those people to believe that what they say is actually going to directly be reflected in policy, and then it isn't, they're going to go away pissed off. But if you are honest with them and you say, look, we just want to hear because it's interesting to us, people will still want to tell you what they think. So the important thing is, regardless of whether it is going to directly be reflected in policy immediately or not, you are realistic with people about the outcomes. Generally speaking, if that is the case, people will still want to be involved. So as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of different types. Some of them we're familiar with: opinion polls, votes, protests, a reform of citizen participation, referendums, etc. But then there's also budgeting. These sorts of practices are becoming increasingly popular in Europe and parts of the US and Canada and other parts of the world. They're growing in popularity. You see a lot of city councils and things like that, and particularly in the US actually now, allocating millions and millions of dollars every year to citizen participation and budgeting projects, where they'll say, okay, we want to spend this amount of money on developing the community. You tell us how it's going to be spent. And there's a whole bunch of platforms now emerging to help that process along. But they can also tackle really, really big issues. So for example, in France, the Citizens Convention on Climate Change brought together experts from all over, selected through sortition for 7 3-day sessions to draft proposals for the government. And the government committed to enacting 146 out of the 149, which is pretty massive. Obviously, there have been some issues following up on that. Not all of them have been strictly pushed through, but because you've got a bunch of people together, they essentially form their own lobby, and they're making sure that the government goes ahead with that. In a completely different context, a completely different sense of participation, in Estonia, there's a citizen initiative portal that allows ordinary citizens to gather signatures, and if it gets more than 1,000 signatures or 1% of the residents of an area, the results have to be discussed in Parliament. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. What we are doing is a bit of a mix of things, and there's a reason for that. We are launching an initiative to create a citizens space policy document. We're going to derive it from input from ordinary people all over the world. We're aggregating it into policy language using AI tools developed expressly for that purpose. So there are platforms like Citizens IS, Go Vocal, etc., that have been set up just to do this and just to scale participatory initiatives like this. We're going to grow it and iterate it year by year to ask more questions, review all assumptions, and make it more complicated and relevant as time goes by. Complicated, but more sophisticated and relevant as time goes by. And where you're going to use it as the basis for advocacy and feed it directly into party and organizational policy. And there's been a couple of very recent developments on that, which are really encouraging. So already we're starting to see organizations like political parties who might be finding themselves increasingly in need of policy on these emerging issues like space, but they need something they can point to that goes, yeah, we're actually listening to people and what people want out of a space policy. So we're starting to have those conversations, and it's really, really exciting. The methodology is basically that we start off with a very simple questionnaire. That questionnaire is intentionally kept simple because one of the guiding principles that we have in this is to remove barriers to entry. We want to make it as simple as possible for anybody, anywhere to participate. And I will show you a little bit more about how we're doing that later. We work with partner organizations to get volunteers and booth placement internationally. So we're taking a kind of active network approach to this, where we go through friends and family, and then through friends and family, and then through friends and family. So we considered initially kind of going out into street corners and getting people to just go out into their community and ask for video responses and things like that. But in actual fact, as you might imagine, it's very, very difficult to get people to respond publicly to those sorts of things. They might just think that you're joking or trying to take the mickey out of them or something like that. So we veered away from that. But what happens is if you go through, whilst in the first iteration, going through friends and family networks might not give you a representative sample, if you go degrees of separation, after one degree of separation after another, you actually approach a representative sample faster than you would if you just keep going out into the street and trying to interview people like that, because you get a wider variety of people. You get more than just the people who are willing and confident enough to engage with others on the street. You actually are utilizing trust networks that already exist. So we conduct the survey, recording answers in text, on video and audio, and with verified permission for use. Those inputs are provided to a platform for aggregation and synthesis. Then we produce a final document that aggregates all those responses into key pillars. We also provide a transparent human review. We present that document to political organizations and conferences. So we're doing a little bit of space industry bubble busting, as well as introducing it to organizations that don't have space policy or might be thinking about space policy. The video content, and this is, I think, really, really interesting, we are going to offer to all partner organizations for use. basically cutting and recutting for documentaries, for which we think would be really exciting to have. If you imagine 1,000 sort of TikTok style videos about people talking about their vision for humanity's future in space, the things you could do with that, like contrasting it with experts talking about how that vision might actually be achieved, what might be necessary in order for it to happen, and the opportunities for a public communications campaign between us and partner organizations to bring more people in to the project, to the initiative, and to things like MoonDAO is really, really cool, I think. So that's what we're going to do there. And then we engage political and civil organizations for MOUs, try and get the other end of the funnel going, and prepare for year 2, expanding the questions, the size of engagement, the scope of advocacy. So this is our sort of rough 4-year plan test. We've done a short test just to make sure the system works. By the end of the year, we're going to be doing a test where we want to get 1,000 participants through and form some institutional partnerships to share the results and to help amplify the campaign. We're expanding to 10,000 participants next year. Follow-up questions, response platform goes live. That means that we've got a platform where everybody and anybody can come on and see all of the other visions that people have provided, scroll through the resulting document, drill down into it, see what and where each of the clauses and statements made in the document, where they came from, how they were derived. In the 3rd year, we start advocacy. So we're up to 100,000 participants now because we've gone another degree of separation. We're up to political engagement and developing that policy funnel. And then beyond that, we're up to 1 million participants, hopefully. And we're doing projects around citizen access to tech, collaborative ownership projects, etc., which of course MoonDAO is already doing. And we'd love to connect with you guys on that. So the impact. And I hope I'm not running out of time too quickly. Just check how am I doing for time?
Yeah.
I can't actually see the clock. So the impact, the stuff that we can be pretty sure about, actually we can be definite about this stuff, is the psychosocial stuff. And that means that at the other end, we have demonstrable evidence that people can agree. And in this day and age, that's incredibly important. The importance cannot be understated, right? Or overstated, I should say. We are at a time of massively increasing political polarization, where everybody has their eyes on the ground in front of them, and it can be really, really difficult to see how everybody can agree on things. And projects like this, because they are fundamentally about the future, they're about creating a vision for the future. I think the further you go out, people tend to agree much more on the what than they do on the how. And we can see that emerging already in our limited test scenarios. We also get a new angle on public engagement. So not just relying on PR, but providing people other ways to engage. We get a unifying vision with receipts, and we get a network of participants that are willing to engage further on the subject. The stuff that we can be somewhat sure of that will be that will happen to some degree or another, is that civil society organizations start becoming more active, including space in their thinking. Participants feel like they have a stake. The public feels a closer sense of connectivity. The space industry bubble is penetrated with external feedback. More young people inspired to participate. New businesses encouraged to enter the market. Political and intergovernmental bodies get real public input, etc., etc. So that's to some degree. The possible stuff, again, can't really be sure of this. It's a bit more long term, but obviously it's quite central to the goal. Political parties and political organizations develop policy in line with citizen interests. Space businesses get more sales because of demystification. Interconnectivity of space and Earth is reflected in other policy areas. Governments pass legislation and adopt citizen-centered policy. Intergovernmental bodies got more traction, etc., etc. And then we have, on into the future, the aspirational. Suffice to say that something like this, we believe, would positively impact virtually all of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but I won't go into any detail about that. You get the idea. And then there's the really aspirational stuff that, we can dream. We can only dream about at this point. So, interoperability of tech, increased global political and policy alignment. Access is an incentive for increasing freedoms and promotes democratic movement around the world, new treaties and international agreements, that sort of stuff. So who are we? Well, as I mentioned before, we're a little advocacy network. We started out journalists and public and civil sector people believing space needs to be talked about. We're on a mission to promote public interest in space and ensure that those interests are represented. Until now, we've just been doing comm stuff, but we've been developing this in the background. And yeah, developing ownership initiatives as a way of giving the global public direct engagement. I am the founder. I was a diplomat for a while. I was a researcher during the Arab Spring, as I mentioned earlier. I'm an advisor and head of product for the Innovation and Politics Institute in Vienna. I edited Democracy Technologies. I was a researcher on citizen participation. Suffice to say, I've done a few things on citizen participation, led briefings, and I founded a company called Democracy Works years ago that did all this kind of stuff as team building exercises for companies. So this is what we already do, as I mentioned. That's where it goes in the funnel. And this is what we're going to do, cut to the chase. So go straight into straight into the political conversation, basically, and introduce public opinion into political parties, civil society organizations, and other bodies in need of policy. Really, at the core of this, just to step away for a second, is a feedback loop. And currently, there is a negative feedback loop, and we want to turn it into a positive one. So this might not get universal agreement, but this is certainly how of elitism, irrelevance, inaccessibility leads to popular disengagement, reduced public interest representation, and reduced long-term benefit, or a possibility for long-term benefit. The positive feedback loop that we want to build is one where citizen participation, political engagement, and optimism create a sense of interconnectivity and opportunity, leading to popular support for space activities, strengthen democratic representation, and enhance long-term benefit. This is a bit that I have in for a different audience mainly, but basically what we want out of institutional partnerships is basically the things we think we can do as data and intelligence services. We're going to ideally have a large number of people providing feedback. We are interested in developing relationships where we can also ask certain audiences and certain demographies and certain geographies different questions if there was things that our partner organizations wanted to know. As the survey gets larger, we can also continue to provide public and strategic communications as we've done in the past, and product and service research. So in the future, if we have a large enough community, we hope that community can be used to bounce ideas off and kind of test theories a little bit. How can you help us? Well, financial support and connections. Again, not MoonDAO specifically. Again, for a different audience. Institutional partnerships and joining our working group. We obviously need more people helping out on the project as well. Something I will say specific to MoonDAO though is one way I envisage a relationship potentially working is through this citizenship thing in MoonDAO, where there are different activities that earn Mooney internally within the internal ecosystem. And what we would love to do is be able to provide MoonDAO citizens with activities that they could do that would earn Mooney. And one of those might be filling out the survey or submitting a video response to the survey. Another might be going out and finding others or gathering survey responses and inputs. So that's the sort of relationship that we can imagine existing in the short term, but also over the medium to long term, really hoping to share some of the content that is generated, the information, the data that's generated. And, you know, I've bounced around the idea of producing a documentary before, but that's not a particularly solid plan at the moment. It's just me dreaming. One of the questions that comes up when I talk about this topic, because a lot of people raise their eyebrow at the very notion of making space a political issue, and a lot of those people work in the sector already. They're a bit concerned that politicizing space might create problems, and I can understand why that perspective exists. So people think politicization is bad for budgets, it's bad for projects, bad for innovation. That basically just makes everything more complicated. But when people think about politicization, usually what they're thinking about is really controversial issues that have two sides butting heads. That's not the case here. In this case, it's the people who care versus the people who don't. So by politicizing space through something like this, the practice of citizen engagement, we're not creating the same kind of antagonism. We're simply shifting people from the false impression that space is a giant waste of money, disconnected from their lives, into an invested population that sees and believes in the value of space and the development of the sector. That is the idea. So that's the usual presentation. I'm gonna check how much time I've got left now, which is about probably 5 to 10 minutes, and take the opportunity to show you what we did recently, which is a actual demonstration of how the survey will work. So this is not a final version. This is just a test run we did over the last month. Again, sort of friends and family version, basically, but it's our proof of concept. So the survey was accessed like this. We had a little bit of an explainer. And as I mentioned, we keep it very, very simple. The idea is to allow anybody to participate in this. We've had some challenges on that, like the idea has been raised that perhaps we should be, having some kind of educational component of it. But that's kind of part of the problem that we're addressing is people feel like they need to know more than they do in order to be involved and have a say. So we want to kind of get people where they are already. And one of the ways you can do that is by starting in the far future. So first of all, we ask people whether or not they think space is important. And for the sake of this, I'm going to say, yeah, it's fairly important. We ask people whether they think space is interesting. And yeah, it's sort of interesting. And then we go into their vision. And this first question, it's kind of like, if you think about the first question as encouraging people to kind of like walk through the door and dream a little bit. We're trying to embrace the fact that for a lot of people, space might be a kind of dreamy neverland and not really a real thing for them. So we ask them, the first question is, okay, we want you to imagine a future, the ideal future. Because that's the other thing is a lot of the time when people talk about, if you just ask them straight up, what do you think humanity's future in space is going to look like? More often than not, you would get one kind of dystopia or another. There would be a whole bunch of people who say, oh, well, it's just going to be, dominated by corporate oligarchs kind of, drilling out moons. And there would be a whole bunch of people who think, oh, it's just going to be dominated by an extension of existing geopolitical, quarrels here on Earth. So we want to frame it in an optimistic way, which is why we say, hey, look, imagine the perfect future, imagine your ideal future, and tell us what role space plays in that future. How does it affect your everyday life? To what extent do we exist and interact with it? How do we interact with each other? And we encourage people to be as detailed as they like. So I'm not going to be as detailed as I like here. I'm just going to say, well, ideally, well, everything is awesome. And then the second question is really the meat and potatoes of it. So that first question, the responses to that, that's kind of our vision statement, basically. The second question is where the policy language is actually derived from. Because once we've gotten people to imagine the future, then we walk it back to the present, we say, okay, well, now we've imagined that future. How do we get there? What do you think businesses, governments, and other actors should be doing right now in order to make that vision a reality? And again, we encourage the people to be as detailed as they like. I'm not going to be detailed. I'm just going to say, do better. And then, as mentioned as well, we provide people with the opportunity to submit their responses, not just as text, but we encourage them to submit them as audio files or even better, video files. And as part of that, to facilitate that, what we're actually thinking about doing now is setting up booths in, I guess you call them space experience locations in as many places as we possibly can. So things like observatories, technology museums, places where people go as families or, to experience space, to interact. They come in already in the sort of frame of mind where they want to learn and interact. And if we can set up basically survey booths in these sorts of places where people can not only submit responses, but see how their response is being incorporated and synthesized into this larger thing, we think that would be really inspiring and grab a lot of attention. So yeah, we love the idea of video responses, and obviously there's a lot of ways we can play with video responses later and build public comms. Yep. So then after that, we ask for a little bit of demographic information. I am from Auckland, New Zealand. I am, oh, what year was I born? Right, sorry. 1985. Auckland, oh, my keyboard is being terrible. Auckland, New Zealand. And that's me. Do you work in any of these fields? We want to gather a little bit of information about what the context is, basically. So where people are coming from. Yes, yes, a little bit in the past, perhaps, and in the past a little bit. Do you have personal interest in any of these fields? In the final version, obviously, there's going to be a lot more options for this. But yes, yes, yes. Let's just say yes for everything. And then we go submit. So once it's been submitted, it goes into a database like this one. And this is the platform that we're using. This platform was developed by an organization called Go Vocal. And as I mentioned earlier, it's in general the responses in participatory projects. So we can go through all the responses individually. You can see for each question, some people have submitted individual sentences, some people have submitted paragraphs, some people have submitted multiple paragraphs. And over here, the default summary generated by an AI, it's not just your standard sort of GPT, it's been specifically designed for this purpose. And as I mentioned, it brings receipts. So every time it makes a statement, it tells you exactly where it got that information from, which is really, really cool. So out of this very limited trial version of this survey, we already have a vision statement for humanity's future in space, which is really pretty awesome. Then we go down here to the bit I mentioned before, and this summary is what people actually want governments and businesses and other organizations to be doing right now. That is even cooler. And we can ask it, not just look at the existing summary, but we can actually ask it very specific questions. So one of the questions that I asked it really early on was, can you format this like a policy document? And of course, the answer is yes, it can. So we go through this rudimentary policy document that includes sections like equity, access, anti-monopolization, sustainability and environmental protection, public engagement, education awareness, economic development, ethical principles, etc., etc. This is all derived from the responses of this first little survey that we did. Imagine something like this where we had 1,000 responses, 10,000 responses, 100,000 responses or more. Imagine how powerful that would be. We can even ask it other questions. So I said, could you produce a white paper for space governance? Could you produce a policy description for a political party using only those concepts where there is strong consensus? And of course, yes, it can as well. So you get the idea. We can also explore the responses in more detail. So we can go through the individual responses one by one. And we can query the responses of an individual participant as well as the data set as a whole. So yeah, that is the sort of thing that we can do with this platform and with this initiative. And with that, I'm going to come back to the main screen. There I am. And yeah, our goal, as I mentioned earlier, for this year is to do 1,000. Next year, 10,000. The following year, 100,000. And the sky's the limit, or not, as the case may be. And we'd love to be more closely involved with MoonDAO. We'd love to give MoonDAO citizens extra things that they can do to earn Mooney. And we'd love to cooperate in as many ways as possible by sharing data and the responses and obviously the results that we get out of this initiative as well. So that's it. Thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't go over time. 39 minutes.
No, good. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, very cool. I guess, yeah, just if anybody has any questions in the audience or wants to hop up on stage and chat some more, Phil or Pablo or anybody, feel free to type in the chat or hop up on stage. But yeah, super interesting. I was curious, I know it was like a smaller sample size, friends and family, but were there any like interesting insights or takeaways that you got from that kind of small pool about, I don't know, why things that maybe divide us in terms of what polarizes people about space or where people can really unite? Because yeah, it does suck that, we're seeing more political polarization in the space industry as opposed to, perhaps a few decades ago when people were more kind of united behind the idea, or maybe that's, rose-colored glasses or something like that. But it seems to be that way looking back.
Yeah, I mean, I know it might seem at first glance like if you do a friends and family version of something, so it's obviously very small scale, that of course you're just going to the friends and family of people who are already involved in this project, so they're probably going to be somewhat aligned. But I think you might be surprised. Like I know that as a group we went out and we spoke to like parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, that sort of stuff, right? And very quickly you find people who either know very little or have no clue about what's going on in the space sector, but that doesn't mean they don't have dreams for the future and how things ought to be. And I think what is neglected so much in our current, I'm not going to try not to get too political, but I think what is neglected so much in our current political discourse is actually describing and articulating what the future looks like, regardless of your political persuasion. And it is fundamentally a unifying thing. And it's important for contextualizing all the things that you actually do in the present as well. If you go out and ask a given population what what they want the future to look like, I guarantee that you'll get way more solidarity and alignment than you would if you ask questions like how you actually want to get there. And so just the very act of being asked, I mean, how often do people get asked what they want the future to look like? It's all, we're all just mired in debate about the ground in front of us the whole time. We forget to look at the horizon. So yeah, I think it was really
I have
powerful.
an anecdote about this. I've been working with Daniel on trying to get some of these conversations started, and I did go out and ask strangers. Like for one example, there was a clerk behind the counter at a gas station nearby, and I went in to buy a lottery ticket and said, "Hey, can I ask you some questions for my documentary?" And asked these questions that were presented today, and the conversation started with being hesitant, like, oh, I don't really know what it would be, and that that's not the question. The question is, what do you wish it could be, and then back from there. And they had a lot to say, and that's that common trend with every single person I've asked, is it just being there to listen. Turns out every person has a lot of opinions and ideas, and most of them overlap in the sense of, well, I think we should, the government should be there to invest in education, for example. Private companies should, there should be competition and that instead of domination by governments, is another example. And, a lot of thinking about the expansion into outer space is different than when different cultures expanded to other areas of the earth and displaced people that were already there, because right now there are no people that are already there to be displaced. And that's an interesting thought and interesting way to frame the problem, that these people were already thinking about being, just operating a cash register, or another one was fixing my tire on my car when I got a flat. And listening is really the important part. And like Daniel said, when you break it down into what people, instead of the how, it's more like, what do you want out of it? There's pretty much universal agreement in how space technology and how humanity's evolution into space is. And we've only gotten a few responses so far. And so it's kind of remarkable. And the thing that is difficult is that politicization, like you said, it has a negative connotation these days because it means debating, arguing. In my opinion, that means people care. So if my dad, for example, doesn't really care about the dealings of the billionaires that are playing around in space, or the government's going to be a government, and it's all, he grew up during the Cold War, and there's a lot of opinions on what is happening. They have ulterior motives. Well, he feels disconnected from the conversation. And I think that's the true problem. And so one thing I really hope that people listening to this conversation feel inspired to do is to bring it up at the dinner table, have the conversations, because even if you're, disagreeing with someone very strongly or have very different opinions, if you're talking about it, that means you care, and that means you're invested, and that means you know that it impacts your life, because space does impact every single person's life on this earth. Space technology, the industry growing into space, using space for anything, work, life, you name it. It does impact every single person's life, whether they know it or not, whether they care or not. So getting people to care means that we could have that industry serve the people that it's affecting, benefit them in a way that they see gets them toward that ideal future. So yeah, that's my soapbox. But I do want to say I have been asking around more than friends and family, just random strangers, and it's incredible how much you can learn. They ended up being 15-minute conversations. I said, "You have 5 minutes," and they ended up talking and explaining the things for 15 minutes, and then we're like, "Oh, sorry, gotta go." So I encourage other people to ask those questions. If you can, it's great to turn on the voice recorder on your phone and record it, so that we can transcribe it and put it in this database later. But yeah, instead of doing more preaching, why space is so great, because we all know that we want to put a settlement on the moon and do all these things. Just listening to what other people already are dreaming about brings a lot of valuable insight.
I absolutely agree with Phil. I think that's kind of the secret sauce to it as well. Like, because people don't ever really get listened to about what out of the future, the means of engagement in a political or policy process are so limited, and narrow, like in so many different respects, that if they give them the opportunity to just kind of open up about what they want the future to look like. I mean, it is for so many people, we're kind of flipping the fact that it's a dreamy neverland for people on its head and turning it into an advantage, in my view, because when they first respond to that question, they might be going, "Oh, I'm just going to say how I wish everything was and what I wish was happening at the moment," without any expectation that anything will actually change. But if we can take all of that, and I think we can, if we can take all of those responses, synthesize them into something beautiful and meaningful, and then go out and actually get decision makers to listen. And not only that, but actually get it incorporated into their real policy platforms and sort of manifest it in any small way. Then you've started to reverse that feedback loop. Then you've started to create a positive feedback loop where people go, "Oh shit, okay, like having an opinion, and not only am I entitled to it, but it's valuable."
Totally, yeah. A little side story, but yeah, it definitely, I was blown away by MoonDAO in the beginning, because it was just like, okay, I'm just a regular guy out here living wherever, and it was like, oh, I can just jump into this with permissionlessly and start participating. I can vote on proposals, I can interact, I can kind of have my voice in the space sector, at least within the context of what MoonDAO is working on and projects we're working on. And it was just super cool. Like, nowhere else can you do something like that, and just being able to participate, being able to have a voice, being able to help decide the direction that MoonDAO is taking, or who we want to send to space, or how we're going to do it, or whatever. All those things are just amazing. I think most people just feel like it's not something, well, people wrongly obviously think that it doesn't impact their daily lives, whether they're requesting an Uber ride or whatever. They're using all sorts of space tech on a day-to-day basis, but they think it doesn't impact them, for one. And then they also think that, it's just totally inaccessible. There's no way that they can interact with it. It's obviously a plaything for billionaires, or just the select few NASA astronauts or whatever. So it's like platforms like MoonDAO, or, just what you guys are working on, being able to have those conversations and seeing how people care about it, how they can have an impact there, I think is super important.
I want to comment on something that was posted in the chat as well, and it feeds off of this conversation. If you watch the news and you see a lot of things, especially in American news, there's a lot of chaos in funding around space science, funding to NASA, and now contracts with SpaceX, which is, a major contributor to the space industry and everything else that we're talking about today. And I want to mention that, like, personally, like, when I see these things, I don't see how those type of issues are really tying back to me and you and our lives. I don't like if I were to ask my neighbor, what do you think about NASA, Glenn losing its funding and having to close? And they'd probably be like, well, we can spend that money somewhere else, right? But if you have that personal interest in those changes and where the funding is going, what the government is doing, where it's spending its money, where the contracts are going, how it's doing it, if it actually served us as humans and citizens of that society, would it look this way? And so when I see these news things, I just feel even more motivated to go and talk to people around me and get the people that are pulling the levers and making the deals to actually think about me. And as a citizen of Earth and soon the moon, to think, is pulling a contract from SpaceX, from the federal government, for the benefit of the industry, for the benefit of the progress of humanity, or for the benefit of someone else that already has $1 billion. So I just wanted to comment on that because it is the world we live in. I don't want to shy around that topic, but I do see it as extremely motivating for Celestial Commons and MoonDAO to actually be there and allow my peers, friends, and family to matter in those choices instead of kind of being a casualty or collateral damage.
Just like funneling more people into the conversation, right? And through, I mean, whatever way we can, because pardon the pun, otherwise everything's just going to happen in a vacuum, right? It's without public sentiment, without public oversight, without public. And I know there might be, like, we might perceive some sort of, I don't know if you describe it as a clash, but like obviously MoonDAO is fundamentally about decentralization, right? But it operates alongside centralized processes, centralized institutions. In my view, the more you can democratize those institutions, the more like public involvement, public sentiment, public oversight, public feedback you can funnel into those fundamentally centralized institutions. That is a kind of decentralization in and of itself, at least so insofar as you can achieve within centralized institutions, right? So I don't see the fact that MoonDAO operates as a decentralized organization, and the fact that Celestial Commons is about trying to, feed public sentiment into the policy of centralized institutions as antagonistic at all. I see it as complementary.
Well, yeah, I mean, MoonDAO's, trying to build a platform for all sorts of voices and opinions and conversations, and having, Celestial Commons and Space for Humanity, and whoever wants to be part of these conversations is all like, what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the rails and the infrastructure for all this sort of participation by regular folks. So I don't think it's antagonistic at all. But yeah, we are coming up here at the top of the hour. Thanks again so much, Daniel, Phil, for hopping up here too. I guess, Daniel, is there anywhere, you mentioned like a working group, but is there a good way for folks to reach out, connect, follow along with what you're doing, or, an email? They
Yep.
can
So
stay in touch with you.
I'll write my email in the chat. My email is daniel@celestialcommons.org. We're doing a bit of a relaunch of the site at the moment around this participation project. It's not live at the moment, so apologies for that. But if you want to get involved more directly, yeah, you can also message Phil. Phil's working on the project. Yeah. More than happy to have more contributors. We have a weekly meeting. There's a bunch of stuff going on different fronts at the moment, from outreach and engagement to participatory design and other things. So the more the merrier. We'd be really happy to have you. And of course, we want to keep the conversation going about how we and MoonDAO can work together. And I think at some point in the next couple of weeks, what I'd love to do is introduce a bit of a to the MoonDAO community to sort of deliberate on and discuss for how that might actually take place. And obviously we can all discuss it, because I think there's a whole bunch of ways in which the MoonDAO community can contribute directly, and how we can offer things to MoonDAO as well. So I'd love to follow up on that.
Totally. Yeah. I'd love to see a thread posted in our ideation channel under City Hall, get that conversation going, see what that might look like. But awesome. I don't know, we had the iSpace lunar landing happening too during this conversation. I don't know where that stands, if it was able to successfully touch down or not. So I think we had some competing crowds out there looking for that. Oh, I lost Daniel, but yeah. We don't have any project updates this week. A couple of our Senate project leads are out. So basically this conversation. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this week. Hopefully iSpace was successful. But yeah, status is unknown. Okay, Paula says the status is unknown for Kuto. Interesting. Cool. But yeah, we'll see what happens with the lander. Thanks again, Daniel. Super interesting convo. We'll see you all again next week, Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Have a good week.